from American-made F-16 fighter jets? How many Israelis have to be stripped and searched the way Palestinians are at checkpoints on an hourly basis? During the first 3 weeks of the present Intifada, which began in October of 2000, 1 million bullets were fired by Israeli military personnel at Palestinian civilians. Neither Indians demonstrating against the British nor South African blacks fighting against apartheid faced anything like this, nor for that matter did they have to reckon with missiles, hundreds of tanks, helicopters, and jets, and rocket attacks fired into civilian areas as well as refugee camps with no defenses or arms, whatever. Yesterday, 11 people were killed. Consider that on the internet for January the 23rd, one can read, and I picked this at random, one can read that 836 Muslim pilgrims to Mecca from Gaza were denied permission to leave. The Palestinian Catholic cardinal was detained and prevented from leaving Tel Aviv airport. Some towns on the West Bank have already sustained 214 days of curfew. That on same day, 150 dunams of fertile agricultural land were razed in Gaza. On the same day, 3 people, 2 of them civilians, were killed and 6 homes demolished. On the same day, 62 shops in the village of Nazdat Isa were flattened to the ground. And on the same day, literally thousands of people, many of them pregnant women, sick and aged men and women, children trying to get to school, doctors hoping to reach their patients and their hospitals, professors and undergraduates desperate to get to their classes, with 3 universities closed. I've never seen in the American university a word said, and all talk about academic freedom, never a movement or a statement said about Palestinian freedom of education. Universities and schools have been closed systematically for the past 35 years, and no one has the courage or decency to put up a petition talking about academic freedom. Three universities closed, and ordinary human beings shopping, looking for food or work, all of these detained every single day by the endless number of checkpoints, over 300 of them, that punctuate the existence of Palestinians in the occupied territories. 3 days ago, 12 Palestinians were killed as a result of an Israeli incursion into Gaza, which has got to be the most horrible place in the world, made so by the Israeli occupations. Dozens more injured, tens of houses demolished. In varying degrees of severity and brutality, this sort of thing has been going on there every day for 35 years, as in the meantime, dozens and dozens of new settlements have been set up on Palestinian land, and 400,000 settlers are on Palestinian territory today. They crowd nearly every available hilltop. Conversely, ask the question, how many Palestinian settlements have infringed on Israeli property? How many daily armed incursions, sometimes with 60 tanks at a time, have penetrated Israeli towns and villages? How many Israeli fields have been burned? With all the ritual and fuss surrounding the planting of trees in Israel, does anyone bother to recall that an average of 896 Palestinian trees per day have been uprooted by Israeli settlers and soldiers since the beginning of the Intifada in October 2000? For this kind of brutalizing assault, the United States and Israel designed what they called a peace process that lasted 10 years, which was not even supposed to put a stop to this, but rather to make it seem slightly less unbearable. Yes, a peace process requiring thousands of hours of negotiations to make Israel stop, which of course it didn't. You have to use your memory to keep in mind that since the current Intifada began 2.5 years ago, representations of all this have been available on the international media, but they simply do not render anything like the harsh awfulness of what life is like for a Palestinian on a daily basis. Tim Llewellyn, a well-respected veteran BBC reporter, has recently shown that when one deplorable Palestinian suicide bombing in December took place, it was reported, he says, as if it were, and I quote him here, the beginning of a new cycle of violence, end of quote. Whereas the fact that 75 Palestinians had been killed in the preceding month, 14 of them children under the age of 18, simply went unmentioned, as did the fact of military occupation and resistance to it. The efforts of Israel's spin doctors, Llewellyn says, the US government and media, in conjunction with a weak Arab communications operation, have usually combined to make Israel's broad version of events prevail. These continue to give the impression of a struggle between equal forces, a beleaguered and misunderstood Israel, occasionally forced into excessive measures to clamp down on terror, versus hordes of recalcitrant Palestinians careless of Western values and endemically suicidal for obscure religious reasons. Equivalence, he says, is at the heart of Britain's misreporting of the crisis, a charge that can be doubled and redoubled for American misreporting. Making the astonishing illegality and inhumanity of Israel's policy of Palestinian immiseration even more difficult to recall or actually see, not only for outsiders, so to speak, but even for Israelis themselves, is that, as Amira Haas, admirable reporter who lives on the West Bank, writes in Haaretz on January the 22nd, and I quote, "A person could travel the length and breadth of the West Bank without ever knowing not only the names of the villages and cities whose lands were confiscated to build the Jewish settlements and neighborhoods, but even the fact that they exist. Most of their names cannot be found on the road signs. And from a distance, the calls of the muezzins and the streets empty of people. After all, there's nothing for them to go out to, and if they wanted to, they couldn't because of the curfew. The streets, the empty of people, seem like an aesthetic decoration. A Jew traveling on the almost empty roads of the West Bank would think that there are no longer any Arabs. They do not travel on the wide roads used by Jews." End of quote. It's equally significant of the assault on memory and visible reality that the entire Gaza Strip, which contains about 1.3 Palestinians and a mere 7,000 Israeli settlers who control the entire water resources of the Strip, as they do elsewhere in the occupied territories, and are protected by thousands of Israeli soldiers, the entirety of Gaza is surrounded by an electrified wire fence, making Gaza, as an Israeli journalist has noted, in effect, a gigantic prison. Both Ehud Barak and now Ariel Sharon have pressed ahead with the building of a fantastically expensive wall, most of it paid for by American taxpayers, which, quite apart from destroying more Arab land and separating towns from their farms on a vast scale, is designed, in fact, to blot out the existence of the Palestinians. This is what is meant, in effect, by separation, a kind of a hallucinatory delusion by which an entire people is removed from sight. Several members of the Israeli government speak without the slightest embarrassment about removing all the Arabs, as they are insultingly called, from the West Bank, Gaza, and even Israel, especially in the event of a war in Iraq, as if those millions of Palestine's native inhabitants were so many insects to be swatted aside, out of sight and out of mind. All of this has gone on with the full support, now amounting to over $135 billion of the United States and us, its passive taxpayers. This tremendous assault on memory, to say nothing about current reality and human decency, is quite without precedent or analogy in our postmodern times. Not in former Yugoslavia, nor in Africa, nor elsewhere in Asia and Australia. By contrast, I would want to remark that all these efforts on such a scale have not achieved their goal. In every possible way, the diverse affirmations of Palestinian identity, far from being a negative or passive thing, have grown first and foremost a culture of human rights and democratic process at the grassroots level that has included a sensitive register of the claims of memory, the demand for attention and justice despite the world's indifference, and a healthy awareness of the ironies of unequal power. The other fact I'd like to note here is that even though in the US and parts of Western Europe the notion of Palestine is associated invidiously with violence and terror, there is, as I said earlier, a serious contradiction to that superficial association in an ongoing and recognized Palestinian national life, which has a quite peculiar, if not outright, tenacity to it that has simply overcome most of the terrible ordeals placed in its path. There is today a Palestinian cinema, there's a Palestinian literature, a Palestinian political, legal, and scholarly discourse, Palestinian theater, a Palestinian oral tradition. A large number of Palestinian